Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa. Warm greetings. Welcome to this morning's session, Diversity and Inclusion, on the third day of our conference. Ko Alan Borum taka ungoa. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive Youth Justice Services for Oranga Tamariki Ministry for Children in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I'm beaming to you today from Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, where we're into our second day of comparative freedom from what was our third lockdown. And we've got two great presentations for you this morning. We are due to finish at 11:50 a.m. New Zealand time, and then we'll go straight into our break once we're finished. Before we get started, for those that might not be familiar, hopefully you are, but if you're not familiar with the platform, just a quick reminder, the session will be recorded and it is available on demand. I've been having a look at those, they've been great. The screen can be enlarged and made full screen if you need it. That does seem to come across much better. If you've got a question for the presenters, please ask it in the Q&A. I'll be looking through those and we'll make sure I can try to get your question up. And if you want to discuss with others in the audience or share your thoughts, please post that in the discussion forum. First up, I'm delighted to introduce Tracy Karanui-Golf from Talking Trouble. She's going to talk to you about enabling Rangatahi and Whānau to shape how participation happens in the youth justice space. Tracy currently delivers communication assistant as an independent practitioner for Talking Trouble Aotearoa, New Zealand. She is one of the only full-time Māori court communication assistants in the justice system. She has extensive experience working with people with moderate to profound hearing impairments. Thank you, Tracy, for joining us today. Over to you.
Kia ora koutou. I am a speech language therapist and court-appointed communication assistant, and my kaupapa today is enabling Rangatahi and Whānau to shape how participation happens in youth justice spaces. Ko waio, ko te rarawa tuku iwi, ko Ngāti Moipunga tūhapu, ko Kaimaumo taku turanga waiwai, engari no Tāmaki Makaurau ahau. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Firstly, I want to acknowledge my Indigenous brothers and sisters and their lands. I want to acknowledge those who are willing to share their lived experiences and also those Indigenous kaimahi that are willing to fight for the rights of our people through your mahi and advocacy. We're often trying to awhi or support our people from within systems that have colonised and dehumanised our own people, and that isn't easy, so aroha atu. I work as a speech and language therapist and court-appointed communication assistant. My colleagues Sally Kedge and Elaine McKee have presented in this forum before me, and if you haven't seen their mahi, I'd encourage you to go and have a look. This presentation today is dedicated to my nanny, Queenie Karanui, who passed away last week after a long life of service to bettering the lives of Rangatahi Māori through aroha and manaaki. Haere, 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 nene. Oke, oke mai te rangi Māori, oke, oke, ake, ake. So, most of the rangatahi we work with in justice spaces haven't randomly stumbled into these spaces. We know there is a significant correlation between care and protection, school truancy, stand downs and transiency with youth injustice. Part of the mahi I do at Talking Trouble is to awhi mai tauiwi, so non-Māori SRTs, to think about how lived experiences and the societal and historical whakapapa of New Zealand impact how whānau Māori might participate in legal settings. We're asking our young people to participate in really very complex spaces. Not only do they need to have the language and communication skills, but we're often expecting them to instantly assimilate to a completely different culture inside of courtrooms. Assimilation is tricky, and there is no doubt that it is much easier to move fluidly between worlds and cultures when you have positive experiences to frame your skills around. Think about court. the bowing, the knocking on the wall to indicate that there's a need to stand, my learned friends, ma'am, the tall postures, the straight faces, not to mention the language of law. As the adults of the kaimahi of these rangatahi, it must be our responsibility to make safe spaces. And our safe spaces allow rangatiratanga, mana motu hake, and they allow rangatahi and whānau to leave with mahi. So what we need to do is to consider our expectations. We often think about content. We know what it is we need to talk about, and we know what's coming up. But do we always think about context? My wero, or my first challenge for you, after this hui, and you'll see my weros in the red flags, is to think about context before content. Think about whakapapa first. What has happened to and with this whānau that might impact on the content that you need to get to? Because my message is that careful consideration about lived experiences and how that might impact communication allow for whānau to make space that is comfortable for them. My second wero is that you plan communication. What we want to be doing is to figure out things that might help so that we can have mana motuhake, mana, rangatiratanga, and we can avoid things that won't help, so we can avoid self-doubt, guilt, and shame. So what we need to be doing as kaimahi supporting rangatahi and whānau is to plan communication. We have to know what is the tricky stuff that this whānau might have to think about, what are the things that we can help, and what are the things that don't help. So that brings me to how do we figure this out? So when I started my mahi at Talking Trouble, I very quickly recognised that although the assessments and probes I was using gave me a really rich, detailed information and profile on the language and communication skills of rangatahi and their whānau, I was not getting rich information about contextual stuff, about lived experiences. And the more experience I got in the court, the more I noticed that it was these lived experiences that often predicted how whānau would participate and engage in legal spaces. I began to comfortably explore colonisation and to more comfortably recognise and kind of call out the systemic bias and racism that is entrenched in our colonised systems. And I was willing to highlight the impact that has on my people. I found the Meihana model provided a really concrete way of understanding how the societal and historical whakapapa impacted whānau Māori in justice spaces. I found that by exploring aspects of the model with whānau, we were together, collaboratively, able to identify the barriers and enablers, and such as we began enabling rangatahi and whānau to shape participation in youth justice spaces. I figured out that I wasn't looking just at the young person, but I was looking at the young person and their whānau on a waka, navigating ever-changing winds of racism, marginalisation, colonisation, and migration. On top of that, I had to look at how they roll, or how they navigated their collective skills to navigate these spaces on changing currents. What I'm going to do today is to present a case study of a young man who I've changed the name to Zion. I want to share his communication pūrākau with you, or his communication story, to demonstrate how the Meihana model helped to explore communication to enable whānau to shape participation. So here is Zion and his whānau on their waka. So one of the first things I looked at, and one of the things that we often look at as communication assistants and speech language therapists, is tinana, or physical. So I figured out that there was 3 generations of hearing loss. Zion was diagnosed at 6 years of age. He'd lost 3 sets of hearing aids by 5, and he wasn't entitled to any more. After speaking with his whānau, I realised that Dad and Granddad also had hearing loss, and there had been some really negative experiences with speech language therapy and audiology before. I needed to move carefully in these spaces. The whānau really didn't understand the hearing loss, and they didn't have good self-advocacy skills, so they didn't know how to manage spaces so that they could have better access to spoken language. So what did I do about that? And what did I plan? We planned quiet spaces. We planned that the judges, the lawyers, the FGC, the people holding meetings, they wouldn't do things like walking and talking at the same time, because walking and talking means that you don't have clear access to faces. It's hard to direct sound if you're moving and talking. Another aspect, taio. So I've been told that Zion flips out before meetings even start. And once I explored this a little bit, what I actually figured out was that it was the space rather than the people that were triggering for Zion. He'd had bad experiences in youth justice spaces before. His mum often cried and he often wasn't understood. So we planned to have important hui and safe spaces. We avoid those flip outs before the meeting even started. Iwi katoa is about who's already on the waka, who's on board, who can you share the power with as a professional. And Zion told me that Zach was his bro. So this was my in really. I knew that if Zion wasn't going to have me on board, or he found it difficult to communicate with me, he already had a bro, Zach, that he was good at listening to, that he liked to engage with. So what did we do about that? We planned to upskill Zach. I upskilled him about how tricky talking and listening is and some of the strategies that he could use to help Zion to communicate all of the things that he wanted or needed to. My computer has a mind of its own at the moment. So the next thing we're going to talk about is ngā haue whā, or those ever-changing winds. So we've got Zion and his whānau on the waka, we've learned about hearing loss, we've learned about whānau, and now we're looking at the things that blow this waka, things that are outside of their control. So some of this stuff is triggering: colonisation, marginalisation, migration. They're all really big topics. This whānau had moved 4 times in 4 years, and what that meant is that they had to move schools. When you move schools, you don't get to have good relationships or safe, trusting, built-on relationships with the adults and peers around you. What this means is that you don't get to develop complex communication and language skills like negotiation, like compromise. You don't develop your attention skills to the same level as other people. In general, you haven't had the same experiences and opportunity for language. So what does that mean? We had realistic expectations about what we were asking this young person in whānau to do. And the communication assistant, I explained to the judge and lawyer how difficult assimilation is and how we develop those high-level complex language skills. The next concept, marginalisation. This whānau required urgent referral for audiology and speech and language therapy. This whānau had been discharged from audiology because they hadn't turned up to appointments. They'd moved address often and the hospital hadn't been able to keep up. They sent 4 letters in a row to the same address, and then they were discharged from service when they didn't turn up. This is marginalising behaviour. And it's just entrenched in our systems. So what we did about that as speech and language therapists is that we encouraged Oranga Tamariki to make urgent audiology referrals and urgent speech and language therapy referrals so that we could start to repair the marginalisation that this whānau had been through. Migration. Migration was a big impact for this whānau. The whānau had to come from far and wide, and the young person was often in court in different places to the whānau who were at the other end of the motu. And what this meant is this young person didn't always have whānau in the courtroom, and that really impacted on how they participated, how confident they were, and also how the whānau understood what had happened in court, because it ended up being that I figured out it was this young person who was explaining to whānau what happened in court. And when we're relying on young people with communication disorder to explain to their whānau what's expected of them or what happened in court, we're setting ourselves up for trouble. So what did we do? We called them on Facebook. We live called them in. That's how they rolled. That's how they talked to each other. So that's what they did, and because of that, the whānau was able to engage. We also gathered the information before the hui, so they had time as a whānau to process what they might want to ask. So now we've got the whānau on the waka, we've got the winds pushing them, and now we're looking at how they can. My computer's helping itself again. And now we're looking at how this whānau roll. How do they use their skills all above that waka with those winds to navigate themselves through systems, through spaces? I heard that as soon as Zion got to court, he chucked his hoodie on. And that relates to what I was talking before about that need for instant assimilation. He didn't understand the body language, the kaupapa, the expectations of court, so he stuck with what he knew and he hid behind his hoodie. What I did is I explained to the judge and the lawyers how difficult assimilation is and how difficulty with assimilation correlates to your capacity to communicate and participate in settings. With whānau, I heard Dad never comes, he just sends his sister, she's the only one that's onto it. Apart from being pōti or sad for that to hear, there was a lot to unpick. And so what I realised is that actually, because of Dad's hearing loss and all of the bad experiences he'd had with professionals, he didn't want to come, because it wasn't good for his mana. He didn't understand what was going on. It was better for him to send his sister Sarah, because then she could come back and explain to the whānau information in a way that they understood. So what did we do about that? What communication did we plan? We planned to change communication spaces, and we planned as a team to acknowledge that talking and listening before had been tricky, and we knew we needed to rectify that. Tika. Tika is about how you roll, what's good for you. Tika means like culture. And so I had to figure out, what is tika for Zion? What is good for him? What's he going to let me do? And when I explained my role to him, he said, nah, fuck, yours will treat me like I'm doko. So I realized very quickly that that Zion was whakamā. He was whakamā about his problems of talking and listening, and I needed to work carefully so that I didn't impact his mana. And so how I did that is I used Zach, the mentor, his bro that he already had on the waka. I've trained Zach, done some talking with him about talking and listening. So I was able to sit at the back of the courtroom or sit in the back of meetings and take notes, make them all easy to read, then go through them with Zach, and then sit with Zach and Zion as they had a kōrero. I was able to provide communication assistance in a way that was tika for Zion. So I guess my third wero, or my other challenge for you when you go back to mahi, is to reframe your whakaaro. We often hear these kinds of things on the left, and I want to challenge you to have a new perspective. I want a perspective where Māori are not viewed as in deficit or overrepresented, but a perspective that allows you to see the context and the content, a perspective where you see whakapapa first. If you see Māori are overrepresented, cut that. let's stop that whakaaro. Let's stop reframing like Māori children are more likely to require intervention and assistance. Māori are less likely to engage. And let's reframe our whakaaro. Let's think about kaupapa and whakapapa. We want Māori are more likely to be exposed to risk factors. Māori are more likely to have experienced resource barriers. Māori are more likely to have been offered services that don't align. So that is the end of my kōrero with you today. I've set you three of those wero, and I hope that you've learned something from today. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions. Ngā mihi kia koutou katoa mō tō wā i tēnei rā. Ka kite.
Ngā mihi maiha kia kōrua, Kataraina and Ataru. Thank you for joining us, and I'll hand over to yourselves.
Kia ora, ai. Kei konei, kei kona, kone ke, konaka, i te ao, i te po, te ao marama, i te ao, i te po, te ao marama. Tēnā tātou katoa. Kei te mihi atu ki a koutou katoa i whakarongo mai ana ki tēnei kōrero mihi atu ki a koutou ngā whanaunga o tērā taha o te ao. Greetings to us all and to our whānau over the waters. It's great to be here. Kataraina Pipi, and pleasure to be here presenting alongside Ataru today. We're going to give you, introduce ourselves and then talk a little bit about what is Kaupapa Māori, what is Kaupapa Māori evaluation, and share some experiences and reflections on how agencies might better support Kaupapa Māori evaluation to meet the needs of Rangatahi. And of course, further to that, looking at how we can support transformation of youth justice settings. So, mihi atu ki a koutou katoa. My name's Kataraina Pipi no Ngāti Porou, Ngāti Hine, as mentioned, Auckland based at the moment, and have had the pleasure of working alongside Ataru and his mum Kim in various youth justice settings. So pleasure to be here. Kia ora Ataru.
Kia ora ngā mihi kia koe Kataraina. O tira ki oku iti, oku rahi, oku tāanga tuku iho. I ngā mana whenua huri no i te pāpaka o Māui me te moana nui a kiwa. Good morning to all those and from where you're tuning in from. Kia ora, my name is Ataru. I am, ngā rauru, Ngāti Kahungunu, Ngāti Raukawa descent, and I am tuning in from Christchurch today. And sharing in the acknowledgements of those, of all of the traditional landowners across the Great Wide Pacific and Australasia. I guess for me, just a bit about me and who I am. So my purpose that has brought me here today is really quite simple. And it's all around intergenerational and shared voice. So since stepping more and more into the rangatahi space as a young person, I'm passionate about ensuring that the echoes of our future leaders are heard and rattle the Indigenous world. Optimistic, I know, but as young people, we hold the hope for the future. So I'm really eager to continue the transformation by creating space for our rangatahi to be active collaborators in evaluation for a stronger justice system. Kia ora.
Awesome. And it's lovely to work with Ataru. I work with my daughter and Ataru works with his mum Kim. And I think both our children have told us from time to time that we're too old to be in this space. It's time to move on. Anyway, Kaupapa Māori is essentially a Māori way of doing things. There's been a number of writings acknowledging the work of Graham Smith back in 1990. Who wrote about Kaupapa Māori in the context of education, the transformation of the education system through kohanga reo kura kaupapa. Kaupapa Māori is a term that implies a way of framing and structuring how we think about and do evaluation as Māori, so that our Kaupapa Māori way of doing things is the norm. In the context of evaluation, it's also concerned with both methodology and methods, the way we do things. For more information about Kaupapa Māori, there's a link here to Leone Pihama's Rangahau website. Kaupapa Māori evaluation is a term that is being used to describe the way in which we do evaluation in our Indigenous context, where we're privileging or utilising mātauranga Māori and our Māori ways of knowing and being. And so for us, when we work in our communities, some of these values and principles, such as aroha ki te tangata, having respect for people, titiro whakarongo, look, learn, look and listen before you talk, ngā kaumā, these things are important aspects that determine the way in which we operate. The Kaupapa Māori evaluation also takes us into the space of shifting power, resources and decision making in order for Māori programs that are kaupapa based, and when something is kaupapa based, we might talk about a kaupapa being education, a kaupapa being well-being. In this space, as Māori evaluators, we need to know our place in our space, in our communities. And so, for example, when I go to Ngāti Porou and Ngāti Hine to do evaluation work, there are key people I need to engage with and let them know what I'm doing and why I'm doing, what the kaupapa is, what the purpose is of the visit. On the right there, I just want to acknowledge the work of Dr. Fiona Cram in the Kaupapa Māori evaluation space, and acknowledge that in our various countries here in Aotearoa, we have Māterai, which is a Māori Evaluation Society Association, and NZIA, and in Australia, AES, who have also, just want to acknowledge their developments in the area of supporting First Nations, Indigenous evaluators to be working and leading in their communities. In this slide, I'm acknowledging the work of Nan Wehi Peihana and this framework that she has developed for our consideration about how to support kaupapa Māori evaluation and Indigenous evaluation endeavours. And so as it says, this was developed to support that shared power and decision making in these contexts. And so I remember, I think back over the years in the work that we've done about as Māori, feeling like programs and services were done to us or for us, where we had no power in the decision making. Someone else thought it was a good idea to do something to us in a certain way, but we've moved on from that in many respects. And the space we're most interested in and operating in at the moment is where we're able to flourish as Māori, as Indigenous communities, where we're leading in those spaces. We determine and we decide who comes in space and how we want to operate. And I guess this equally applies to young people having had services and programs done to them or for them, with them, etc. And we're really interested in the youth justice space in ensuring that kaupapa Māori evaluation and in the space of working with rangatahi is done in a particular way.
And I think at the forefront of that, right, when we talk about kaupapa Māori, it is that tino rangatiratanga and that determination by rangatahi, and so allowing them to sit in that as space, and the importance of addressing the multifaceted identities of rangatahi is crucial to their involvement in the evaluation. So having a young person involved in the evaluation process keeps perspectives focused on youth-specific needs and outcomes, and I think allowing that from start to finish, for example, in my role working with my mother and Kataraina, is having that young person at the beginning and going through the process all the way to the end to ensure that that voice is captured. An example of that is, I recall a time where I began evaluating a kaupapa Māori program in a couple of schools in an emerging rohe here in Aotearoa, and the approach was to ensure that the input of young people participating in the program had to shift from a standard interview process, and instead we asked them kind of what as a group would be the best way to interact and engage for them to participate in a way that they felt comfortable. And we tried all kinds of approaches. We asked them if they wanted to do it in pairs, if a group setting worked, and for a couple it did. we asked if there was an opportunity for them to bring a support person to allow that relaxed kind of vibe and that wairua to be okay. And also just holding space. So my background is in youth work, and we talk a lot about whai wāhitanga and allowing that young people to have that space on their terms and on their grounds. And I think having a young person involved in the evaluation process from start to finish also keeps language from becoming complex. As evaluators, we understand the importance of what we're trying to achieve, and then it's up to us to alter the language and to understand what we're asking for and to translate that to fit rangatahi. There's also a level of cultural understanding that rangatahi may be facing on a day-to-day basis. And in the process of evaluation, I think, for example, when I'm evaluating, I ask often if a karakia if they're comfortable having a karakia to open and close to clear that hole, to whakanoa that space. And also framing the process and allowing them to kind of settle into how comfortable they are in their culture. And no matter how uncertain they are, it's just ensuring that they are leading that and determining that for themselves. And the last point for me, I think, in this slide is whānau. And I don't think I can express how important whānau is. It sits as one of the 4 walls of our whole water program, right? And it is ensuring that a whānau approach is done. And like Kataraina said, my mother and myself and her daughter, we kind of carry that through a lot of the evaluation process, ensuring that this mother-daughter and mother-son collaboration brings all the elements of whānau with all the perks and challenges or disagreements that may occur, because that's the reality. And this keeps it from being a tokenized process. And all of these allow for successful and effective evaluation with rangatahi.
Kia ora, Ataru. In our evaluation work, we have a real interest in contributing and supporting the transformation of youth justice settings. And as my way, I guess, I'm relatively new to evaluation work in the youth justice sector, but I am not new to evaluation of Kaupapa Māori programs. And I want to acknowledge these 2 providers, Ikaroa Rangatahi in Hastings, the Ikaroa Rangatahi Social Services in Hastings, who, from my perspective, are providing some leadership in Kaupapa Māori-based youth justice services, and have a very clear kaupapa around devolution, around supporting resources back to the people, and enabling and supporting whānau, hapu and iwi to be leading in their context, which is, there's lots of evidence in the work we've done with them of whānau to whānau approaches, the ways in which they work with young people and their whānau to support them to reach their aspirations. All of this work is supported by kahungunu and the developments that are happening at an iwi level. So their pathway is very clear, and it is a pathway to devolution. Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services equally in the north in their Mahuri program, where they looked at this opportunity to deliver in their context and provide some services differently. And so they've changed around their model, and they're doing things in their particular Ngāpuhi way, which is what we want to see. So what would transformation ideally look like of youth justice settings? Because there's this notion, if we don't know where we're going, we won't know when we get there. So we do need to be going out 25 years from now, 30 years from now. If we do these things now, what will we see? And so we hope that we will see more rangatahi, more youth-led, more Māori, more First Nations-led services initiatives, research and evaluation, and that the evidence base that we've got values and validates Māori and Indigenous worldviews, that resources adequately supporting these services, and that we can build our capacity and capability in this space.
And Sean Wilson's work on Indigenous research method, this is just an excerpt from that, and he defines Indigenous researchers as knowledge seekers who work to progress Indigenous ways of being, knowing and doing in a modern and constantly evolving context. And I think this is even more rapid for rangatahi. The transformation of an entire system can't occur under the control of those who don't in fact use said system. It can't work based on outcomes our rangatahi are told they need to achieve, or by challenges they are forced to overcome, or even by roles that they aren't supported to play. Justin Muhammad talked yesterday about our people, our way, and this is the role I think we need to see our young people taking. Simply put, if it involves young people like me, then it needs to involve young people And to better approach this, it has to take shape through the eyes of those who are forced to live in the world that they are handed each and every day. And what we know is that they are the leaders of tomorrow. I talked about Rangatahi, you know, their voices echoing for generations to come. And I think it's imperative that we understand that they are the leaders. They share directly what they think. They come and they turn up as they are. They don't try and if they do, you know, that's quite often due down to the evaluator. And in evaluation, we have to be sure that we keep the programs and processes accountable and their delivery to the needs of Rangatahi. That's always the question I get asked is, how do we know this is going to work? What's going to happen? Is this just another consultation? So the reassurance of Rangatahi value and voice contribution to the evaluation process in all aspects, but particularly around this journeying into a better justice system for them, I think is the most beneficial part that we can provide them. And that's our role that we play.
E te rangatahi, maranga mai karangatia, no te ao tēnei wā e tūhapa i ngā rātou iwi. Tēnā tātou katoa, kia ora.
Ora.
Really great hearing what you're talking about. You know, having the right evidence is so important to convince policymakers and others for us to be able to do the right thing. Yesterday I was listening to Justin Mohammed talking about the power of that evidence, but it needs to be the right evidence. It has to be reflective of who it's about, and so having this capability is just so critical. And I just want to join with you in the acknowledgement of Te Ikaroa Rangatahi in the Hawke's Bay and Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services, both who have been absolutely groundbreaking in this space, and really neat and exciting to see the work that you are doing with them. A question that I've got for you is, how have you found the evaluation is getting received at different levels? I'm thinking policymakers, academics, the young people themselves. Are you able to talk a bit to us about that?
Just from my perspective, and Ataru may think differently, I you know, we've got a very uncertain time at the moment, and there's transformation happening. So if we look at Oranga Tamariki, for example, it's a very challenging time, structural change, etc. So at the system level, I get a sense that people really want we all want the same thing for young people. It's about the extent to which we're willing to shift and change, that necessary shift of mindsets. But I do want to acknowledge those that are really flying the flag and supporting the work to happen in the way, and taking risks as well, because some of this is unknown territory, but a lot of it is known to us. So we've got to have trust, and we've got to have that our people know their communities and know what to do and how to do it.
Kataraina, Ataru?
Yeah, I think just to add to that as well, I think that part of the power sharing that Kataraina talked about earlier, you know, that's essential, and there is that need for, you can't just give power, it has to be entrusted into someone for them to be able to utilize it. And I think that's part of where we're at the moment, and yeah, the uncertainty, I think we just have to keep being resilient, and young people are the most resilient, and building them more and more resilient each day. So yeah, allowing them to have that space and sharing some of that with them, I think is what makes it successful for us. And I think that's what we try and echo through in our evaluation.
Kia ora. The reasonable risks thing really resonates with me, because I do think that's so important. We've got to have hope and trust, as you say, and take a chance. I can remember 4 years ago working with Ngāpuhi Iwi Social Services, where they had a very clear model of how they could have young people remanded directly into their custody, and because it just wasn't mainstream or known, the level of apprehension around that, whereas today it's so it's not seen as risk-taking anymore today, but someone had to have that faith right at the start, and they were just amazing how they led that. Just thinking about some of the evaluation you've been involved in, what are some of the insights that you've seen that excite you the most?
I think for me it's the affirmation and the validation of of Kaupapa Māori approaches, you know, where we see our people just doing it. And I think also, you know, we've got a lot of work to do in building capability and understanding about evaluation and demystifying evaluation, you know, every day. So the exciting. The Whānau hapu iwi developments are exciting, where we've been able to, you know, get on the same page and have a shared vision and develop a strategy that is led by iwi, that is grounded in communities. Excited about, you know, new and innovative approaches to giving people, essentially.
Absolutely, and there's a level of dismantling in there, which was talked about yesterday as well by Justin, which if you're able to do that, the evidence is really, really necessary. Ataru, do you have some things that excited you the most, some insights that maybe surprised you, or you thought, you know, absolutely, I always knew that, but we never had the evidence before?
Yeah, I think quite often the engagement with rangatahi is overlooked, and in the time that I've spent with the rangatahi that I've done some research with, it's often, and I use a lot of metaphors around food naturally, but it reminds me of there's this whakatauki that talks about ko te kai a te rangatira ko te kōrero, and it's so true, and it sits well with the young people because they have this, like I talked about, it's plain language. You know, they don't overcomplicate their scenarios, their situations. They just say it how it is, and they get you straight to the point. There's no need to. I mean, imagine putting them in a room, you know, with policymakers. It would be this rigid kind of approach to trying to define what it actually meant. But I think that's what excites me the most is their eagerness to change and their hunger for that change and transformation to happen in the fastest and simplest way.
Oh, exciting. No, thank you very much. Again, ngā mihi mai aha, kia korua. My appreciation, our deepest thanks to you for making the time to present to us. This will be uploaded, so it will be on demand, and people will be able to come back and look. So you might well get some people contacting you later because you have put the links on your presentation. So thank you very much.
Ngā mihi.